right. So just to get today's discussion off, there's a few sort of introduction things to go over. First of all, I want to make clear that the views presented here are the views of the individuals. The views that they express are those of the speaker. They do not reflect the official position, policy of or policy of the individual's employees, any governments, or any other entity. Moreover, it's important to understand that at any moment of the debate, any given position may not even be strongly held by the participants, but rather may represent a thought experiment, a devil's advocacy argument, or even sarcasm. Context matters in understanding the statements in a complex and fast-moving conversation. And on that, you are joining us in the middle of an ongoing conversation about a topic. We've known each other for years, and we often have animated discussions. So we're kind of giving you a unique view into discussion that's happening in our circles as we and others navigate the complexity of current events, policy developments, and hard technical questions that underpin it. So we don't have scripts, we don't do multiple takes, we don't have time slots or specific rebuttals or whatever. This is just a sort of live, uncensored, full contact discussion, and sometimes we misspeak, we may correct ourselves, we can be wrong. These sort of things are easily forgiven amongst friends. So we please ask that you extend us the same courtesy. I don't see shit live, man. So on to sort of like who we have here. Sorry, now let me sort of frame what we're going to be discussing, and then I will put forward who we have. So the idea for today's discussion is we want to look at a sort of abstract concept, which is cyber power. And there's a lot of existing literature on what cyber power is. Is it a thing that's wielded by states? Is it the ability to use cyber to impact the real world? We have our own opinions, and we're going to be looking at that. We've put up a link, and we'll be putting that in the description afterwards, reference to the extensive existing literature on the topic. But we want to be looking at sort of cyber power in terms of how it compares to nation state powers and where it exists in a sort of Westphalian and post-Westphalian environment. One of the things that you'll notice is that a lot of the existing discussion does not include the voice of practitioners. It tends to be academics or generals with their opinions who are trying to get funding and so on. And we're trying to correct that by joining the conversation, adding to it the point of view from people sort of on the ground where the rubber meets the road. And those people are myself, the Grug, Jags, who is joining us, Dave Itel, Silas Cutler, JD Work, our special guest, Ciaran Martin, and Nina unfortunately was not able to make it. She's stuck in a snowstorm or an ice storm of some sort in the US, and that has prevented her from showing up. But we wish her the best, and we hope that next time she will be able to join us. So we're looking forward to that. And with that said, I'm gonna open it up and let's go. What do we think of cyber power?
So I guess I'll start off with the sort of strong opinion on this. There's been a lot of discussion about sort of how we approach and how we evaluate cyber power in terms of looking at it from different like quantifiable metrics. I am a distinct proponent, and I think that I really enjoy the process of how we do this, and I like that we are evaluating in these terms. I think there's actually a lot of potential value for practitioners to use these metrics, regardless of what that final numbered outcome is. I think it helps as a different way to reevaluate threats in a larger scale.
I'm curious why cyber power came into. I'm curious about the use of cyber power as a metric. Like, obviously, it's interesting to say on a scale of human development, these folks are further developed in the cyber domain as compared to others. I can imagine that in a, and I would leave this to JD, but I imagine that in a standard military discussion, that might be how we discuss different nations comparatively. It does feel like cyber doesn't necessarily lend itself to that quite so clearly or naturally. So I'm curious if there's a particular agenda driving the emphasis on cyber power, or if we can just discuss it as, this is an idea we've all, we're collectively having about how to measure who's better and worse.
So when we talk cyber power in the sense of metrics and comparative balance, this longstanding idea of of offense defense balance of comparative military forces in a given region often speaks to instability, often speaks to questions of relative threat perception between neighbors. There's a whole series of conventional concepts that come into these sorts of indexes and these sorts of relative ranking efforts. Unfortunately, they've been limited in the kinetic space. It was one thing when you could count tanks and there's something, and eventually codify that into treaties. It's one thing when you count missiles and move to arms limitation. It's a very different thing when you look at capabilities generation in these very non-conventional spaces. And it's always been an awkward fit. And we're increasingly seeing folks try to draw upon a series of disaggregated metrics to create these complex formula that unfortunately it does serve an agenda in some ways, where if you're part of one of those metrics that is aggregated up into one of those big numbers, you can then link your funding requests towards, oh, well, we're increasing relative cyber power by investing in X program or Y institution. There's a lot of that does go into that. And
the new 102 millimeter smoothbore cyber.
Well, but unfortunately, we also run into this weird thing where it takes the place of what is a complex conversation about capability generation, about sophistication, about operational maturity in a space that needs that granularity. And folks just want a number, right? They want the easy button.
I think, first, thanks for having me. Thanks for having me, and thanks for explaining our unintentional handle. I can see these interventions are short and sharp rather than monologues you normally get on these things. Oh, sorry, am I extremely quiet? Is that any better? Okay. Anyway, I'll start again then. Thanks for having me. Sorry for the unintentional mangle. Best wishes to Nina. And I can tell already that these interventions are much pithier than the monologues you normally get in these things. So I'm going to take what I infer to be the spirit of these conversations and take you off on a tangent. Here's a really good book called How Spies Think by a guy called Sir David Omand. Used to be head of GCHQ and basically the national security advisors for the UK back in the post 9/11 days. And on page 241, he's got a thing saying, this bit of analysis is different because the worlds of defense, security, and intelligence now enter our daily lives directly via the internet. So one of the reasons why there's a different challenge with cyber power is that the stuff that makes up cyber power, the stuff that underpins this and everything else, impacts us much more daily, and every citizen has much more daily interaction with it than historically the the tools of state power. Just something to think about in all of this, because I do think the way we interact with technologies is very different in terms of statecraft, because it's so much wrapped up in the experience of everyday citizens and all the rest of it. And that's everything from vulnerability equities processes to, to the use of offensive cyber, and to what you mean by cyber defense. Do you mean, the small savings of an elderly person living alone, or do you mean critical infrastructure? You actually mean both sometimes. Anyway,
those are very interesting points, and I would bounce on that to say, I think one of the interesting things about cyber is not just that it impacts individuals, but that it actually empowers individuals. Because, for example, if you are someone who is looking to have the largest tank force, you better be a dictator, right? Like Joe Average can't go out and look through Jane's defense and decide, all right, I'm now going to be able to challenge, a reasonably sized power on, the tank battlefield. That's not an option. However, if you set out and say, I've got a budget of, 2 or 3 million. I want to just hire a few people, and I want to be able to challenge the US for, cyber control over, I don't know, the Mideast or, Central Asia or something like that. That's entirely possible. That is a thing that an individual can do, because you do not need an industrial base, right? Like that, an industrial base is sort of, in a way, a proxy for traditional nation state power in many ways, because a lot of the projections of power in, say, the military domain or whatever, are actually based on how many resources you can marshal and put together and then project. And it's similar in cyber in that you have to sort of marshal resources and project them, but it doesn't require physical things.
Yeah, I'm kind of jumping on there. I think that's precisely where my discomfort with cyber power as a metric starts to come in, which is we've been talking about in the conventional military side, it makes perfect sense for the entities that wield cyber power to be nations, to be states. It is not the case in cyber at all that that's the only entity that can wield cyber power, and it feels almost unusual that we're going to talk about quantifying on the basis of, well, the UK is particularly good, the US is very good, Israel is very good, Pakistan not so good, but how do we rank a Phineas Fisher or somebody that just comes out of the woodwork and knocks us over the side of the head and essentially switches the dynamic entirely for a period, in a way that not only had we not quantified, but we weren't tracking this entity at all in that matrix.
Well, this is where I think Nina would have weighed in, and I'm really missing her conversation at this point, because her work is extensive around how to think about networks of individuals creating power and how those individuals interface with the state, particularly in the white hat community. We rely so much for our defensive power on that white hat community, and we tend to just think that exists as a function of the state, because it's a thing we've subsumed under the state in just about every other domain. And increasingly, that's not true. Jay Healy and some of the other folks at Cyber Conflict Studies Association for years have been asking the question, what happens when your telecom backbone refuses to allow you to have a cyber war? We have a very different nature of power than other domains.
Yeah, I think absolutely. The other value of measurement in any space like this is that it provides predictability. So, if you look at some of the papers that have come out, they ranked the Netherlands quite high, and at the time, a lot of people were, a little bit annoyed about that. But then you see the Netherlands taking a forward position when it comes to utilizing a sort of very coherent nature of cyber power, and kicking off Emotet would be, I think, the most recent example. And then you have to think back, oh, maybe they were just accurate. Maybe it worked, right? So I think some level of predictability, and you can quibble. I actually like some of the equations coming out being in the sense that they're very simple. They sum up the numbers and then divide by the number of numbers, right? Like, I like that. And then you can quibble about where they got the data from. But the aim of providing predictability is still a good one, I think, either way.
Well, I really like that idea. I really like that idea of predictability, because the thing is there's two really good examples that fall into this. So when we were looking at like WannaCry, there was a lot of concern because we're talking an immediate massive access to things and a very uncontrollable spread of WannaCry. So when you're looking at and trying to evaluate like their cyber powerness, part of it as well is like, are we comfortable with what they've done? And if you look at a contrary example of the SolarWinds incident, I feel like there's a little bit more comfort because we look at Russia as a fairly mature cyber power where they've likely done extensive tool testing. And tried to put in place protections for some of the unintended consequences outside of their operation, which we may not expect from, say, North Korean actors.
So the part where, sorry, Ciaran, go ahead.
Yeah, Jax, I'll come in after you.
All right. So the one thing I'll say, and maybe I'm being a little too pedantic, but if the value of measuring cyber power is some measure of predictability, should we be concerned or not concerned with how entirely inaccurate this is, in the sense that, you know, we could talk about different people's methodology about how they want to measure cyber power or not, but we could even talk about our own. Like, let's say there's people here in this group that have more access to a wider swath of intelligence, whether it's private sector or public sector, about given nations. And even then, I don't think that we could accurately come up with a predictive index of the capability of other nations. To that point, you know, this week alone, the discussion about bitter APT suddenly coming up with an over-the-top 0-day that nobody would have ever thought that they'd have access to. We've talked about solar winds. I didn't, you know, at first I had a hard time with the Russia attribution, precisely because we hadn't seen this sort of supply chain activity from the Russians in the past. I'm not disagreeing with it now. Well, sorry, Silas, you can correct me there. But for me, this was more, I would have been happier to point this in the direction of China with the kind of attacks that we'd seen until we got greater details about this. My point being, there's an index of cyber power that seems reliable right until the second that it isn't. And at that point, it was very much a useless metric as we get sort of slapped in the face.
So
it's a domain of black swans. I think that's the problem. Is like, you can go out and you can say, this is a highly predictable thing. We've been measuring, we've been calculating, we know exactly how things should be. Oh shit, they've come up with something new from left field. And that happens way too frequently for me to be comfortable saying that any particular model is worth relying on for its predictive power, sort of beyond, you know, a rough estimate.
Well, so that's why I said at the beginning, like, perhaps the number isn't the goal, even though, like, that's the end state of, like, running through the exercise. What if, you know, to kind of use the, like, what if it's the friends we make along the way, or the, like, analytical learnings that we make on the way of the process, where that real value is? Because the thing is if you think about it like this, if you have, you know, for solar winds, like, we've seen, like, NotPetya and several of these other, like, large scale attacks from them, like, we know that this is within their wheelhouse. Like, we know that, like, they have the technical capabilities to, or take the recent example of the Bloomberg story today, where they're actually saying it might be related to, like, a specific pre-existing actor that's being tracked. You could look at that actor and say, does this make sense? Like, does this fit with their previous model of things? Does it even fit with the country? Like, are they engaging in this type of behavior? Because if it doesn't fit, either your numbers are wrong, or you're learning something else that's just as important.
So I would want to...
One thing I want to bounce... Oh, shit. Ciaran, go for it.
That's right. I mean, I would want to broaden it out from just the discussion, just from the efficacy and utility of measuring to the actual concept itself, which is, I think, what we're also going to talk about. So on the efficacy of measuring and so on, I mean, I suppose a point broadly in favor of the current sorts of things that are being done, and the and a point of where we might improve it a bit. I mean, in a sense, maybe as someone based in the continent of Europe, people have mentioned the Dutch ranking pre-Emotet, and the Dutch ranking didn't surprise me. Dutch ranking in all sorts of indices relatively highly doesn't surprise me. And let's say, I know this is just a random comparator because it's a much bigger European country, but let's say Italy. So I would have expected as a European, the Netherlands to rank considerably higher than Italy, because they're basically two broad conceptual criteria. One, is it a highly digitized nation? Both are. Two, is its government security apparatus highly organized around digital digital issues and digital threats? And on question two, the Netherlands is, Italy isn't so much. So you would expect the Netherlands. So I wasn't that surprised that, you know, the Netherlands ranked highly, nor am I surprised, frankly, that it's conducted a pretty cool and effective operation recently. On the other hand, I think there is something around this field of work, and Jay Healy's already been quoted by JD, and I think, you know, he is somebody that I would have a great deal of time for on this, which is actually about what you're trying to achieve. And, you know, it depends. You know, one of the issues I have a slight sort of conceptual doubt, and I'll come on to this a little bit, is the concept of what you're trying to achieve. If you're trying to project power, that's one thing. If, which is Jay Healy's starting point, as I understand it, you were talking about this is one of the greatest inventions in modern human history. What do you want to do with it? Then that leads you down a different sort of path. And one of the challenges for all of this is, I think, how do you incentivize responsible use of capabilities? And now, in one thing, that's about restraint and all the rest of it. I don't want to go down that route just yet. And another thing, which is different from, say, other forms of weapons, is about safe storage, frankly. A lot of our countries, including the two represented in this, don't have a perfect record in that respect. And that's, but the ways of looking at cyber power don't potentially penalize you for that, and maybe they should, because if I think we should incentivize the better management of that risk. So that's one thing. The second point, sorry, I'm going on longer than most people, but there is a point about the concepts around all of this. What is the offensive side for? And again, I was reminded of this week because the British government gave its most detailed outline yet of its most extensive use of offensive cyber power. But it was in 2016 against so-called Islamic State. So what's that about? It's the use of offensive cyber to degrade Islamic State's digital capabilities, and that was in support of three objectives. Number one, it was in support of military allies who were taking them on in the battlefield ahead of the Mosul offensive. Number two, it was degrading their ability to coordinate terrorist attacks in the Middle East, in their sort of core area of the Middle East. And the third, it was degrading their capability to radicalize Westerners who might be prone to their propaganda and might carry out self-starting attacks. Those are all three very noble and laudable objectives if you can achieve them proportionately and lawfully. They've got nothing to do with the other side. They've got nothing to do with cybersecurity. And so sometimes we have this, very simple offense plus defense equals the safety of your cyber domain. And I think we can all agree that is nonsense. And I think one of the reasons why, even just as a former practitioner, the debate can be quite frustrating is that we're not very clear often in this discussion what we mean, what the offensive capabilities are actually for, because they're not about cybersecurity. They're about whatever security threat you may face that these set of tools might bring a capability towards. I'm done.
I mean, you would almost have as another metric the idea of measuring how much you've integrated your cyber capabilities with your other elements of national power, if I understand you correctly.
I mean, yeah, but again, it depends on the goal, and I think it's partly reflected in this discussion. Is the goal to measure it properly, which I think has some advantages, but it's not the end. It's not the be all and end all. But yeah, I mean, I think that's one thing, and the other thing is the sort of responsibility. So how do you incentivize, given that these are dangerous things, and playing in this sphere carries risk? And I don't think the way we talk about cyber power properly captures some of the risk decisions that particularly Western countries that care about civilian impact, care about rule of law, care about economic prosperity, the security of civilian technology, and so on. I don't really think that the discussion often enough captures that.
So that brings up an interesting dynamic in the measurement of cyber power. And it was something that I know I joked about in our last call, but that I think has to be taken into account. To what extent is cyber power an index of raw capability versus the discernment that goes into its application and use? Obviously, the United States has an outsized capability compared to most nations. However, it also seems to have some of the greatest restraint in what it does, and how many lawyers are in the room involved in whatever it is that you're trying to do, and that even seems to show up in the code sometimes. To what extent do we measure that? Obviously, it's a greater sense of maturity for that nation. It's a greater sense of the rule of law and restraint and all the things that come with being a sort of restrained, mature actor in the space. But when it comes to cyber power alone as a measurement, does that rank the US lower than a nation that's willing to use its relatively lower cyber power in a much greater, outsized, irresponsible way to make its point? Say Iran, North Korea, where we've seen them get itchy and sort of just decide to use it even for ridiculous reasons.
Well, so this then comes to the thing of, is control something that makes, like, strengthens power, or does it, like, take away from it? Because the thing is you could argue that acting in an irresponsible and a, like, less mature model makes you a more dangerous threat in terms of the, like, whole internet ecosystem, but at the same time it also sort of diminishes the like the long-term strength and the long-term ability to maintain that.
So small states are
So
hitting above their weight with this, and that's where the lack of restraint comes. They're able to demonstrate that they can hit above that weight, but that their ability to sustain that, particularly when that draws pressure from other players. The robot in Operation Automobile, for example, was very much above the weight we expected from that class of capabilities in those years, in terms of the ability to hold the global financial system at some degree of risk and generate damage. The long-term impact of that damage was much less than I think the adversary thought it would be. They thought they were hitting harder. In fact, their leadership was being briefed that they were hitting harder, as far as we understand from industry reporting. And at the end of the day, that disconnects between what their leadership thought that power was for and what they could achieve with it, and what they were actually doing, is a huge question. And in response, we saw, frankly, the lack of effective coordination in the West, leading to some very interesting dynamics where, the private sector felt abandoned by its governments. We've talked about this in earlier conversations. I won't belabor that point. But we also saw the development of aggressive counter-cyber thinking, including counter-force leadership targeting, which was not the usual thing that states had to contend with. And when you see these interactions, it's not just about the number itself. And this is where I really have a challenge with the way in which we think about that number being generated and how it contributes to those complex issues. Yes, the realm of experts coming out of certain technical universities being a contributor to that capability generation was important. On the other hand, you're measuring aggregate scientific, technical, STEM programs at high schools doesn't do the same thing for you as looking at individual cases that you trace.
So one of the things that came up that I wanted to talk about is the sort of like the effects of the exercise of power and how that reflects back on how we view someone as having power. So, for example, like North Korea is pretty wild and crazy, but on the other hand, they do not actually suffer anything for what they do. There's no checks on their cyber. You can't sanction them anymore. There's nothing left to sanction. You can't, really do much else to them. So if they go wild on the cybers, so be it. That's up to them. And what I wanted to point out is sort of one of the ways that in prison gangs, the way that they can establish power and dominance is by, first of all, establishing that they are a legitimate threat. And so, for example, the way that the Mexican mafia moves into a new prison is that even though there'll be, 4 Mexican mafia guys in a prison of 2,000 people, they will show up and within the first week, they'll just kill 4 people. Like randomly, they'll go out and be like, all right, this guy, he's wearing white shoes and fuck him, he's dead. And in doing that, they will have established that they are literally willing to kill over nothing. At that point, when they show up and say, okay, now we're going to extort you for money, people don't go, yeah, you and what army? They go, oh, right. The guys who will literally do anything. Okay, I will take them seriously. And I think that the sort of psychology of that actually makes sense in a way in cyber as well, because if you look at the US and you say to the US, like, all right, they've got huge amounts of capability. They can do anything that they want, but they don't, right? They have a very particular risk profile that they're willing to accept. If you're ISIS, they'll go out of their way, but if you're a neo-Nazi, they won't touch you. So neo-Nazis can get away with a lot of shit that, radical Islamists could not. And that's just part of the risk profile that the US is willing to accept in cyber. They're not Like they don't want to be attributed. They will use O days rather than 1 days a lot of the time, not saying forever, but basically they want to be ghosts. Whereas China, particularly pre 2014, 2015, they didn't care, right? They wanted the stuff. They did not give a shit. If they could show up, steal their stuff, and get attributed right back to like a guy at a desk playing on Facebook while he's operating, so what, right?
Let's be clear on the targeting. Like, I feel like you're bringing up a really important point, perhaps even inadvertently, in that we definitely have different types of interactions in mind. We have different types of targeting in mind, and I think that it's important both on the maturity and the power scale, which is to say, yes, a country like Iran or North Korea looks more violent, looks more aggressive, in that they're willing to dispute petty shit over, with cyber power. And it looks aggressive because you've got all these inadvertent bystanders that get hit by something that seems outsized because it's a nation involved in a way that they shouldn't be. However, I think that what would be an obvious argument for some of the government folks that isn't necessarily an obvious argument for those of us in the private sector is that the genuine application of cyber power is in some hybrid application of warfare that we are almost certainly not seeing, and for the most part will not see. And at that point, the power index makes a lot more sense when you start talking about, the capabilities of the UK and the US and Israel and so on, where they're going to apply it to conflicts that are far more meaningful, far less visible, versus, punishing banks and movie studios for saying things that they shouldn't say. And in that sense, maybe that's really obvious, but it isn't something obvious in the way that we're discussing it in the private sector.
So
Okay.
that brings up
I have
something
a dumb
that,
question.
sorry.
Go ahead. All right, I'm going to ask my dumb question. Since we have like at least 3 people here who deal with incident response at a level I never will, what percentage of things do you get incoming that you have essentially no attribution on of a reasonable quality? Like, where is the dark matter here? That's a terrible phrase because someone's actually using it as a company name, but you see what I'm saying? Like, maybe it's not a terrible phrase. I don't know. It might be a genius phrase.
You mean dark energy? Where's the dark energy? That'll be easier.
Where's the dark stuff, right? Like, what percentage? Where's the tip of the iceberg? I don't know.
So, well, in my experience on attributions, it's quite hard to give a headline measure, because if it was something that looked kind of routine criminal, even with significant impact, you often had no attribution at all, but you were kind of confident that because it didn't fit the MO of any of the big 4 nation states, it wasn't one of them. And therefore, whilst it was an act that you had to worry about because of its public impact, ransomware is the classic, it's going to disrupt a public service. It's a criminal, they're after money, so their strategic intent doesn't matter. So if those cases were included in your percentage total, then you have no idea on quite a lot of attributions at national level when I ran the UK's National Cybersecurity Centre, for example. However, if you then look at things with, it's intellectual property theft from a major corporation, who might that be? Oh, it's a really sneaky intrusion into an energy company, who might that be? Oh, they're sniffing around banks, in a really crude and quite noisy way, who might that be? And then you got to varying degrees of technical confidence from, we've got absolutely nothing to go on, but this kind of feels a bit Chinese to me, all the way through to, in my case, a government minister making a formal statement saying it was you. So actually, attribution, I think, again, sorry, I'm not being very helpful here, Dave, but, the metric of attribution is almost, a percentage metric of attribution was almost impossible, because for criminals, we often had no idea. For nation states, you often had a hunch and you sought proof.
So
Silas.
So I'll say, like, when I think there's plenty of times where things start out in that nebulous space where it's the like, we're not sure quite what this is. However, you only kind of get that once. essentially, because the thing is, I mean, it's such a critical part, and it's why we do attribution, why we do clustering of sets in the private sector, is so that way, if we see it once, we can have ways to recognize it again. And over time, and as more things develop, like, we're able to put a full story together. There's not really a time where it's a one-off incident that is completely forgotten. Like, we're always trying to make sure those things do get wrapped up over time. And there's cases that are kind of those anomalous things, but they're constantly being reviewed. And actually, Jags is usually my poster case for those cases, like going back and hunting those cases and resolving them years later, because we constantly keep looking at them to see if new things have come up or we found any new leads.
So thanks for that. I mean, it's a hobby for me, but I think there's something to be said about the relevance factor of a story. And that's where I think Dave's use of, dark matter or dark energy or whatever you want to call it, this sort of unaccounted for detritus, is important, because what we're looking at, and oftentimes what governments are looking at, are things that have in some way shown their relevance. Because the amount of malware and the amount of intrusions that we see on a daily basis is frankly overwhelming. I want to point those two things out. There's an overwhelming amount of artifacts collected, alerts going up, genuine intrusions happening, a lot of them largely irrelevant. At the same time, there is a lot of it that's just not worth anybody's time. Somebody opened a zip file, somebody, opened a bit of ransomware, somebody opened a banking Trojan that was floating around the nethers from however many years ago. However, we've also seen that for some of the most significant incidents ever in the history of cyber as we know it so far, those detections had already been there. That malware had already been collected. It was just sitting in these 5, 6, 7 petabyte troves of malware that VirusTotal and some of the bigger AVs have had, and we just didn't know that it was relevant. And I think that's sort of the issue that we're facing is detection systems aren't great. They're still better than our human ability to account for the intent behind a lot of these intrusion sets. And maybe I can keep going back, Coast can keep going back, folks can keep saying, where did this relevant set of, 10 years ago, why did it matter? But for the most part, so much is going past us that we just have not accounted for. I don't really know I don't think it's a stupid question, Dave. I think if anything, it's pointing to the fact that we are all dancing on the tip of an iceberg. And, I don't know how do we account for the rest of the body of this.
Well, and when we look at this, we see states deliberately leveraging these commodity capabilities in these low and slow activities. We see states deliberately leveraging collisions of capabilities that they know have misattribution potential as well as deliberate deception potential. But we also run into a very unusual thing where states, especially those with immature programs, are constantly playing with and testing these things that are floating out there, because in many cases, they're better than what the state has indigenously developed. And all these complex measures of cyber power presume a, SATR or a Krupp Iron Works. They presume a classic 1920s era of arms development that just does not ring true in this domain. And this is where, when you look at these non-state players, again, I'll call it Jag's work on Wild Neutron, for example, where you've got this incredibly interesting, innovative, apparently hacker for hire mercenary capability that sort of sits out there in a very unique space. We can look at a variety of these other access as a service type capabilities that are being spun up, whether it's Dark Basin, whether it's some of the other things that honestly the policy community is just now struggling to get its head around. They tried to look at tools, looking at Vasnar and looking at the other arms control mechanisms in order to try to restrict the tools, not realizing it's the integration of the tools into a capability for the projection of that power. To Ciaran's point of what is this for? Well, in this case, if it's for espionage, if it's for operational preparation of the environment, it looks and rings a certain way. The use of that power versus power for norm setting, power for standards definition, power for diplomacy is a very different creature. And we see states do very different things there.
it's interesting that we bring up, that you bring up Wild Neutron. I had Wild Neutron in mind for a lot of that. I have to give much more credit to folks like, the researchers at Kaspersky, at Symantec, that dealt with Wild Neutron and Butterfly, Morpho, whatever you want to call it. I do want to bring it up, particularly because A, that's one of those cases where we have no sense of attribution. B, they're clearly very, very capable. They came and went twice, and nobody was able to account for them. But in particular, if they're not a nation state, which they very well could be, they certainly seem to be taking some kind of tasking from somebody. If they're not, it speaks directly to one of the points from the beginning of this conversation, which is it's obviously an entity that ranges somewhere in that power index that isn't, as far as we can tell, a particular state. And it brings us back to this issue of we seem to be ranking these accumulations of power and capability that are grounded in institutions that we have every reason to expect has sustained cyber power, as you would expect of, SIGINT agencies and different organizations in different countries. What about these things that come out of nowhere, these sort of shots in the dark with a lot of power, a lot of capability, that take on massive organizations in the private sector that do seemingly counterterrorism activities, et cetera, that are not only unpredictable, but fade into the background and give us next to no information as to where we should be, attaching that capability.
So one interesting thing that this reminded me of, just the, first of all, Silas's mentioning of predictive power, and now the discussion of private capability, is sort of in 2007 or so, a friend of mine told me that he had a very, very effective way of predicting which nations would become sort of cyber powers within about a 2-year span. And it turned out to be very, very accurate. What he did was he looked at who was dominating the website defacement charts at the time. And you'd see, okay, Brazil, very, very heavy on website defacements. And then sort of once they grew out of that website defacement phase, you would have this cadre of people who knew cyber, who were risk tolerant, and who were able to do things and were happy to do things. And that's sort of where that was coming from. And his prediction at the time was the next one to look for would be Turkey. And I sort of find that interesting because during the Qatar hack in 2017, that was actually done by Turks. They were pen testers, they were working for hire. They didn't know it was part of a nation state thing, but this was literally like, you could have, in theory, predicted where you would find these clusters of cyber soldiers who are ready to be deployed based on what teenagers were doing, and what teenagers were doing was defacing websites. So I don't think that website defacement metrics is something that was being fed into a lot of, briefs by intelligence agencies as a predictor of future capability. So,
do you think though that Bugcrowd and HackerOne's top hacker list is sort of the more newer equivalent of that, and that potentially that same model still works for kind of looking at some of the future predictive outcome, future prediction of it?
And also the so I think it's the bug bounty thing, but it's also going to be the CTFs, the capture the flags are sort of, those are the new hacker underground, even though they're not an underground and they're not sort of, they're not hackers in a black hat sense, but that's sort of where the energy is these days. It's in these two communities, and it's sort of interesting to look at, okay, where are the clusters? And what you see with the bug bounties is there's huge clusters in India. And what I think is strange is that you don't see that reflected in a nation state capability from India, app.in being an example of something that was used at the nation state level and was just an absolute embarrassment. So I'm curious,
So I'll actually reference Halvar, who's not here today, but he often talks or has mentioned in the past about the idea that the bug bounty ecosystem is functioning sort of as a mechanical Turk in the old sense, not the branded product sense, churning on the vulnerabilities in the ecosystem. Individuals may cut their teeth there, but in aggregate, it's not developing the capabilities for further outward paths that we've seen. And we've looked at this question rather extensively in a couple of places where we're trying to trace some of the participants. And I don't know whether it's the nature of the work, the disaggregation, the scoping. There's something missing there, and I don't know why. So which is definitely present in the capture the flag capabilities. The capture the flag capabilities are real teams playing, sometimes one hand tied behind their back. Actually playing under that kind of handicap is the fun part for some folks, where they can't bring any of the cool things they know and do, and therefore they're really restrained.
So one of the things that I think shows up with bug bounties is that the nature of the reward system in a bug bounty is that it doesn't drive people to have the best, most ingenious and cleverest sort of exploit. It actually rewards people who can find one trick and then scale it really well. So if you find one way of detecting a particular class of vulnerability, and then you can get on 100 different bug bounty programs and blast that out, you will get 100 rewards. And that's what gets rewarded, is the ability to scale. So it's driving a business process. It's driving innovation towards being a better bug bounty business person than it is towards being a better hacker. That's my belief.
So the true unique nature of offensive cyber operations as a military innovation is that concept of scale, but it's not translating across into the kinds of scale I guess we look at in military ops. Sorry, I think I stepped on Ciaran there. My apologies.
No, I think it was me kind of trying to fold in something from the chat, and hopefully not to take away from wherever you're going with this, JD, but I feel like two things. The Grug sort of took us from like the lowest possible end of cyber capability in, defacements. Then we're talking about bug bounty stuff, and seeing that we have Katie Masuris in the chat, and she, I think, is quite accurately kind of supporting the point that, just by the design of these bug bounty platforms, you are keeping this low hanging fruit around, you are incentivizing this sort of mechanical Turk approach to low hanging fruit. I would like to pin that back to this maturity scale that we've been discussing. And you've got your defacements, you've got your low-end cyber criminals, you've got the folks that are trying to do some of this more above board CTF or bug bounty side of the house. Can we at least chart the course of where we see that maturity / power model actually getting supercharged to what you would expect for nation state capabilities, for the kind of military ops that you're going on to, JD? I mean, like, we're jumping a lacuna between those two that I think is quite meaningful, right? There isn't a charted course of going from, your casual defacements to, we've got Raytheon style frameworks being developed and deployed. And while, those of us in the Western world might take it for granted, there's a lot of people trying to just make that jump and cross that gap. So where do we see that if we're going to develop a metric of cyber power? It seems that we're going from the over 9,000s to the 500s, and what's happening in between, right? And sorry, JD, I know I cut you off at that point.
No worries. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't stepping too much on our guests. See. Okay.
Yeah. See, please.
No. It was. I mean, that was a fascinating discussion. Not all of which getting into such a level of detail that I sometimes struggled with it, if I'm honest. I think I was interested going way back to the analogy that I know nothing about sort of dynamics of say a prison population and so forth. Now, with the caveat that I know nothing about that, I suspect that at least theoretically, if not in reality, there is supposed to be a level starting point for each of the participants in that population. I mean, that's the purpose. They're incarcerated in a fixed enclosed space with equal rights and limitations and restrictions on what they can do. No one is supposed to have power. No one is supposed to have a starting advantage over another. So I'm not sort of pointlessly criticizing the analogy. I'm just saying that what it doesn't capture, and I think North Korea is the extreme example of this, it doesn't capture the imbalances between different states and different societies, open, free, highly digitized ones and the other. So, I was really taken with the thing, what is there left to, it's not just what is there left to sanction in North Korea, it's what's there left to do to North Korea. I mean, the North Korean population has a government that doesn't care about it and is its most potent threat. We both are, all the participants on this call are fortunate enough to live in societies where at least most of the time, and if not, we have some agency to do something about it. Our governments are incentivized to care what we think and to care about the harm inflicted on us. And I do think that rather than actually, so that's the sort of counterpoint, or indeed opposite point of if you're measuring scales of cyber power, do you overinflate the reckless small actor that doesn't care about its populations over the restraint of, say, the United States of America? I don't think actually most of the work on this does, nor do I think it should. I think there's more you can do to incentivize and measure sort of responsible activity. But at the same time, it shows some of the limits of a concept. I mean, I do think actually, in response to the North Korea question, I do think you just have to accept that short of military conflict, sometimes, in terms of all our state capabilities, what is there left to do to North Korea? Literally, seriously, whether it's sanctions, what is there left to do we haven't already done? China, on the other hand, is a bit more interesting. I still think that Suzanne Spalding and others have a point that, imperfect though it was, threatening China with sanctions, linking it to its cyber activity and threatening it with sanctions in 2015 was a panicked response from Beijing. They flew people over on a Sunday ahead of a state visit and cut a deal, and I can vouch for operational experience that it gave the West a couple or three quieter years before it didn't.
We're looking at you on the mic a little bit.
Okay. Sorry. So I'm just saying that, with North Korea, there's nothing left you can do. But with China, there are things that you can do. Some of them cyber, some of them not cyber. And so I'll...
Right. So one of the things I think is very valuable from that to sort of play on is that, on the one hand, like just to stick with North Korea for a while, when they threatened Sony, that was a credible threat. They were like, we're going to wreck you with our cybers if you do not comply. And Sony was like, we will not comply. Or wait, we will comply. Actually, we're not sure what we're going to do. And then sort of North Korea did their worst. And it turns out that their worst, it just wasn't that bad. It wasn't great for the people that got fired. It certainly reflected badly on Sony, the way that it sort of treated some of its employees and things like that. But it didn't.
I don't know if I agree with you, man.
Sony.
Have we seen another movie about North Korea come out? Like, I think they achieved their goals, and I think they achieved them for a very reasonable price. And I don't think we're ever going to see another movie come out on North Korea.
I would even take it a step further and say that the ability to soft power influence in a very hostile way, like the threat against Sony from North Korea from being hit again, but also we're seeing it with the Hong Kong censorship from China. Like, it showed that there is a model for this to be used.
Case in point to what Dave brought up. I don't know if anybody's kept up with what's happening with this movie about Khashoggi, the dissident. No streaming service was willing to pick that movie up and distribute it. In a day, in the day and age when you can film yourself doing nothing at home, you can literally film wood burning and put it on Netflix. No one wants to pick up a documentary by somebody that won Netflix awards because it's about, anyways.
Well, a live paper that Dave blogs on the net isn't going to get him hit by a hostile state. Oh, wait, maybe, but...
Well, before we lose
Dave, for sure, yeah.
Ciaran, I want to ask him a question about cyber power. And it is this. Is there any point whatsoever in measuring the United Kingdom's cyber power in isolation from the United States?
That's a hard question, so I can always pretend my mic's not working again. But, I
This is
suppose
a guest of ours. Why would you do this to him?
I'm
Because I can.
not going for another 25, not going for another 20 minutes or so. And sorry to anybody watching, but I have to go and sort out some family dinner. I was accused before we started of prioritizing family over the internet, but I said because it's nearly 6 p.m. here, I've done 10 hours of doing the opposite. So I think I've earned it. I think on that, I mean, I broadly no, of course there isn't, but I also think that we're never going to have measures that we should get too hung up on. We really aren't. Firstly, I do think, and this goes way back to the start of the discussion, the sort of Jay Healy point, which we'll never agree on across a broad community. I mean, even if we got agreement on this call, you'll never get an agreement between the people, the technological pioneers who think they're changing the world, and in some respects they are. The military strategists and national security, thinkers who are thinking in terms of, what this latest gadgetry means for the projection of state power and the defense of national security interests. And frankly, the millions of people in between who don't really think about these things at all. I think they can be useful. I think they do drive some behaviors, and they do drive, indirectly quite a lot of behaviors, which is why I do think that there's a thing around incentivizing responsible use in pursuit of wider social goals, because I think that's the key thing that, I've been sort of filibustering because it's such a difficult question. I think if I've got one useful part of this answer, is that for cyber power measurement as a whole, is that it cannot just narrowly be about the projection of state power. It needs to be about the projection of wider social domestic goals, because it's about technology, and that's what technology is primarily about these days.
Right. So I think on that, sort of one of the interesting things is that as we mentioned earlier, cyber is it's sort of best understood as an arrow in the quiver. But basically, it's part of the tool set that states have to project power and to affect change in their world around them, sort of to force compliance, such as when North Korea says we don't want fucking any more movies made about us, so they create compliance. When China says we want movies that deal with the Emperor Qin, he will have to be portrayed as a good guy, but they use money for that. So when they support movies, they make sure that there are people are portrayed the correct way. And cyber is just sort of, on the one hand, it fits within that, but on the other hand, I do think that it's important to realize that again, cyber is not exclusively a state capability. It's not like we individually do not have dime. Like we don't have diplomacy or information or military or economic power that we can use against the state. But if Dave gets angry against Italy, Italy will be very, very sorry, right? Like he individually has the power to force compliance on a nation state, should he so choose to, as an example. But so that's an important thing I think that should be kept in mind, is that the cyber is much more egalitarian than these other powers that exist. I think one of the other things that's important to understand about cyber power is in a lot of ways, it actually rests on the vulnerability of the people that you are attempting to pressure. So, as people love to say, the US is the most vulnerable, we're like super exposed, like we're weak, we're, all this stuff. And to a degree that's bullshit, but to another degree that's correct, in that the US does have a huge amount of integration of cyber into everyday society, into not just critical national infrastructure, but just the way that everything works right now. People need a lot of cyber stuff just to go about their daily lives. I would argue that Kazakhstan is probably not vulnerable in a similar way. If you took out Tinder, you would, destroy New York. But if you take out Tinder, I don't think Kazakhstan is going to really, suffer. It wouldn't impact them in the same way. So I think that's another thing that gets missed, and that's one of the reasons I find the use of cyber against ISIS so interesting, because ISIS is not a particularly, they were not a particularly cyber heavy force. At least, like they had a military power, they had the sort of broader terrorist capability, they had their recruitment efforts, they had a bunch of different things, and some of them were more exposed to cyber than others. But in general, you couldn't cyber ISIS off the face of the earth. Right? If you decided to like unleash the cybers, you wouldn't be able to wipe them out using only cyber.
But that's sorry, Jags, you go first, and I'll come in.
No, I was just going to say I think he's massively underestimating the Tinder scene in Kazakhstan. But beyond that, I actually wanted to kind of throw this back to a bit of a meta discussion on the concept of cyber power at all, which is, if Dave is going to come at Ciaran and say, is there a point in measuring cyber, the UK's cyber power without relation to the US, I would actually push that back on the concept itself and say, is cyber power a useful metric or context for anything other than states bickering with each other? Because we've talked about entities that have cyber power that have nothing to do with states. We're talking about allegiances between this sort of broad blocks of nations that are obviously collaborating with each other for all sorts of different things, whether it's 5-9, 14-9, CT10, whatever you want to call it. What is the point of cyber power as a concept at all, other than funding, for any entity other than nations sort of, whipping them out and measuring them at each other?
And that's generated for any organization, right? What is the organization's function? How does it come about? This is the point of the DICE target, was the movement of personnel, the inspiration of individuals for disaggregated attack options, the funding stream, the sense of caliphate, in so much as if you look at their fantasies, this militarized fantasy that they were making real in the blood of innocents in Iraq and Syria, there are some very dangerous things that came out of that idea. And it propagated via these new communications technologies that one was able to interdict only through the use of offensive cyber capabilities. When you look at other classes of disputes between national capabilities and individual organizations, North Korean disputing the idea of ridicule around the leadership structure was just as important. The failure of the Sony case, and the reason why it still resonates, is that the state or the group of states that company operated and that organization relied upon for protection under the Westphalian model absolutely failed to do anything to protect them, failed to do anything to effectively respond to that adversary. And I have a real problem with that, because we effectively gave the heckler's veto to an authoritarian dictator that under every measure of power failed to measure up to the states arrayed against them. But we left the weakest member of that coalition, the private company, the one that was most restrained by law and convention, unable to act on their own accord, especially with all the connotations of where that company was headquartered. Now, the next time around, we will not see that level of restraint. My view is, my understanding is, there's a number of entities that whose boards turned to them and said, "You will never be Sony. It does not matter what the law of the states we're operating in are. You will create for me a capability that ensures we will never become Sony." And what that means for stability in the state system matters. We don't measure any of that when we talk power.
I'm not sure that, I mean, maybe it's because I'm not based in the United States, but and certainly I'm not sure our legal framework over here would cope with that, to the extent that the discussions here said we're not going to be the next Sony, would be about defenses, not about privately acquired offensive capabilities. And I think, to go back to the previous point about ISIL and so on, I do think that, potent state-backed cyber attackers, by definition, most of the time should certainly have good operational security. Stateless prescribed terrorist organizations will not be able to acquire extensive offensive cyber capabilities without presenting a huge target on them, which will lead to wider disruption. So I think actually we're almost arriving at clear evidence of a situation where cyber offense is best used against threats that are nothing to do with offensive cyber. Everything from stateless terrorist groups to pedophiles and so forth. And when it gets to cyber capable or digital capabilities, it tends to be troll farms like the Internet Research Agency, or when it gets to cyber itself, cyber attack, it tends to be organized crime. But I just thought, given what you said at the start about thought experiments and so on, here's one. Let's imagine, and you'll demolish this within seconds because you're all sort of smarter on this stuff than I am, but let's imagine a completely implausible situation where you've got a state, let's say the size of Singapore, with the mentality of Singapore, right? And instead of deciding we're going to be the high-tech source of market-driven growth in Asia, they say, right, we're going to build the highest tech economy in the world, and we're going to protect it. We're going to build in protections. It's going to be superb. It's going to be as close to impregnable as any advanced digital system can be. So even to including state-of-the-art, intelligence-led defenses and so forth, and so on. But we have no interest in projecting that power anywhere else. We're not going to hack anybody. We may do a little bit of forward defending to try and find out things, but we're going to just, you can't sell a box, you can't sell a phone, you can't sell anything here unless it's got, much better security. What would we consider that country to be in terms of a cyber power? Because it would be a digitally highly advanced country that was suffering very little harm in cyberspace, but it would have no interest in doing it. It's just a thought experiment for the hell of it.
It's a fantastic
Luxembourg.
I was going to also point out Estonia as well. Like, they spent years, and I mean, they were one of the very early states to really try and establish a very highly set up, well done digital system. So yeah, digital resiliency is
not founded by Russia, but then of course that was 2007, and of course since then, because they didn't, as a lot of countries don't, when they're doing sort of rapid government-led strategic digitization, they forget about security. At least they used to. So Estonia, there are several phases of that.
OPM.
You're just going to drop that in there, just OPM?
Well, if you're talking about like rapid digitalization without caring about security, that's a perfect example.
So my thought experiment would be Estonia phase 2, say, not Estonia phase 1, highly digitized, and even the Estonian counterparts I came across in the Estonian government would never have claimed they were digitally impregnable. So I'm conjuring up. It's a bit like perfect competition in economics. It's such a wildly implausible scenario. It's not actually achievable. But I just think, as a theoretical construct, if we're interested in cyber power, what would a highly advanced, digitized, highly secure nation with no interest in projecting that through digital means look like?
Google.
Would it look like Japan?
Google.
I also think that, we talk about breakout time with conventional and nuclear weapons, and we do not talk about it with cyber, because the theoretical country that you're talking about, even if they choose not to develop into that technology tree, could probably reach it very quickly and reach a very advanced section of it by utilizing their current knowledge base that's very defensive. So, but I think that's something that we really do have to take into account when we build these, when we decide who's going to sit at the table when we discuss cyber norms and export control and all of these other issues. And we're not taking into account countries that are so close to the breakout point that they just haven't chosen to go there.
Or we haven't caught them going there. Because
one thing to build on that
their use is so, we haven't caught them going there because their use is so much more constrained than we think of that power. We were in a fascinating discussion about a particular South American country where there's a lot of latent capability, a lot of players. There is not the national level focus because the national level focus is internal, it's coup proofing, it's corruption, it's a whole bunch of other dynamics. We can see all these different ways in which power is exercised for different regime types. At the same time, we ignore the ones that are staring us in the face as these major, sophisticated, aggressive players, because we just haven't seen it play out in the places we expected to see it.
So one of the things I want to carry on with that idea of a super defended country is, so we often talk about like how cyber is a fairly confusing space, and that something that's offensive could also just be something that's pure espionage, which is also right next to shaping the battlefield, which is literally one line of code away from destroying a piece of national infrastructure. Like it's very nebulous. And what I wanted to put forward was the idea of like, so you've got this country that is just super secure and they have no interest in doing anything offensive. But actually, one of the things that they could do that would be offensive in a way would be to find, so, you know, if there's one country, for example, that's being pressured, they're very vulnerable in cyber, they get hacked all the time, and that puts them in a weak position against someone who happens to be a common enemy of this secure state. That secure state could offer a bulletproof hosting environment. They could say, look, you guys, we will remove your exposure. You will no longer be vulnerable. You just need to use our cloud. And if you're running on our stuff, you're no longer exposed to extortion on this cyber field because you cease to be vulnerable. Their power vanishes. And I think that's, again, that's like putting that out as it's one of the things that makes cyber interesting, is that pure defense can actually be an offensive capability in that it robs someone else's offense of its power.
Have we ever seen an environment that is truly secure enough to make that kind of strategic reassurance a viable prospect? I mean, that is effectively the state equivalent of saying Oracle's "I'm unhackable" premise, right? It would never be accepted upon its face.
Google.
I mean, that's kind of what I suppose that is such a theoretical construct. I mean, you know, I don't know if any of you came across in other studies, you know, the concept of perfect competition in economics, where, you know, if somebody raises the price by 1 cent, they get all the business and everybody else goes out of business. And it's just, you know, it's a similar thing, but it's just because we're trying to find ways of looking at a cyber power thing, it is like perfect competition, a request to suspend belief in reality, to work out what does that mean. If that were possible, you know, is that a desirable position? Would that country be in cyber power? Because it would certainly be a digital. It would be digitally. It would be a happy, probably successful society with an advanced digital set of capabilities, driving a highly functioning economy. But it may not be, on most definitions, a cyber power, which is quite interesting.
So, I mean, I would say it is a cyber power, but I have a very, very broad, expansive idea of what counts as cyber. And you know, as I just said, I do believe that like defense is actually a form of cyber power in that it, by negating someone else's capability. So just to use a very, very crude example, censorship is a way that you deal with information operations. Right? If you do not allow the other side to put forward their narratives, you have, you know, stripped them of their power. It's not, you know, I'm not suggesting that's a desirable thing or whatever, but it does say that like simply being able to stop attacks is itself a worthwhile capability. And, you know, I think just to bring it back to prison yards, which I know is really the locus of this conversation. One of the things that's useful about prisons in a sense is that there's not a lot of defense that you can do against a knife, right? Basically what they end up with is the only capabilities they have are offensive. You can stab people, you can beat them up, but it's not really possible to not be stabbed or to, you know, be in a state where you cannot be beaten up. And that reflects cyber in some ways. Like it's not a good analogy in a lot of ways, but it does put forward the idea of like, look, the way that you stop getting stabbed is by having more people with you who will retaliate if it happens. And
You're just describing
that's how
you're describing NATO at this point, and we're to some,
NATO is basically NATO is basically giving all their lunch money to the US, right? Like they're not actually
and we're hoping that the US is going to come and actually retaliate when it has to. Look, I want to go back to this concept that, we joked about Google, but half joked. I mean, I as far as you can treat it as sort of a supranational entity, the notion of impregnability and bulletproof hosting and, not being subject to the offensive whims of other nations. I think Google's a good example. But I wanted to bring up sort of to Ciaran's point. I think for me, as much as I dislike the concept of cyber power in the first place, the fact that it isn't taking into account impregnability as the furthest extent of defense is what makes the whole concept fall apart, right? It is only accounting for offensive capability, at least as far as other folks seem to be describing it to this point. It speaks of a raw power, the US having this amazing offensive capability. To what extent is it useful going against a nation that, I'm not going to name any nation in particular, but it's still, using sticks and stones to defend itself and has no real internet infrastructure, et cetera. Obviously, that nation is in no way able to defend itself against conventional military power in the first place, but it is very much not subject to any relative cyber power measurement should ground to zero in a conflict where the players are US and totally undeveloped nation. What is the measure of cyber power at that point? And I think the fact that defense is in no way a part of that metric, to me, makes the concept of cyber power sort of seem empty.
So I want to note something as well with this, and that's I think we keep looking at, so if a world power wanted to bring people onto their cloud, I think defensiveness kind of doesn't even need to go into it at all. I think what entirely is possible is simply through, we've seen some countries doing this already, where it's, if you're going to do business in our country, you must host data within our country, which essentially gives them effectively a control over that external party. And they can encourage other countries to do this as well through financial markets. And the SWIFT system is one of those areas where I think this is occurring as well.
So I think that is a great point. But at a time when the metaphors are getting towards NATO and the US and others being the equivalent of prison yard stabbers, it's probably a good time for me to jump off. But thank you so much for having me. I learned a lot, and I don't think we solved it, but I hope we shed a bit of light on it. And I'll chat to you all again soon. Sorry to have to duck out a little bit early.
Thank you for joining us. It was great to have you.
I will note that the focus on offense comes from this idea that this is such an offensive advantage environment. We don't think about defense because defense is frankly not credible. I've been on a tear recently on Twitter around some of the practical examples refuting the position that we've successfully achieved deterrence through denial via reduction of vulnerabilities. And that's clearly not the case when you look at these major vulnerabilities. Come on. It's 2021 and we have a pseudo vuln. We've had some absurd bugs that point to the pervasiveness of insecurity in these small pieces loosely joined. It maybe we get to a future state in which that is not the case. Maybe we get to a future state where we can say that a bulletproof level of layered, ramified defensive infrastructure or defensible infrastructure or defensible cyberspace architected as a whole, as my colleague Jay Healy likes to speak to, is something we can think about. Until then, we're looking at power as it's manifest. And in many ways, it's that raw power, but it's also that latent power. The thing we all know is haunting us. Katie was talking in the chat channel around the warnings that were issued around vulnerabilities in Sony. I take that story very, very strongly, because there are so many times where we've seen knowledge of specific vulnerabilities, warning of adversary intent to exploit those vulnerabilities, turn into these headline-making cases, and a million other cases that aren't the headline-making cases. And these are the ones that haunt me personally, haunt many of us, I think. And I really give much credence to that view.
Okay, I contest the idea that defense is not credible. Like I agree, it's not easy, and I would agree that if someone says we will provide you a completely nation state proof, rated for 72 hours of direct attack by SVR, hosting or something like that, that's not credible. But on the other hand, I would say that Google is a very good example of a cyber power that has a very, very credible defensive position. And I'm aware of cases where there have been people who are targets of nation state attacks via cyber stuff. And this has been, against their blogs or, hacking their emails. And these sort of very, very basic attacks that we understand are cyber attacks, but we don't really credit as being particularly useful. They're hugely important when you're like a dissident and the government wants to find out, who are you communicating with? What's your network? Who's reading your blog? Can we modify what you say? These things are important, and Google is actually a very, very credible defensive posture for these people to then shift to if they start using Gmail and if they start using, a hosted secure blocking service. Then
the ban hammer comes down. Right. I mean, that's the point at which Google doesn't do any offensive, push beyond its borders, but to the extent that you can use them as some impenetrable dam, that's great until Tag decides that they've had enough with you, and all of a sudden all that you're doing goes down. To be honest with you, I mean, the concept of cyber power just keeps getting more and more hollow in my view, and I think not just over what Ciaran is bringing up with defense, not just over sort of my distaste for the fact that we aren't talking about relative capabilities, but I think it's also the fact that cyber power in and of itself seems like a crude oversimplification. And I think one example of that is, let's take a nation like Vietnam or India and say, okay, we're going to give them a ranking of, they're not over 9,000. We're going to put them at 2,500. They've got some capability, and they have some cyber power in the barrel. And this might not be right for Vietnam in and of itself, but let's say India, everything we've seen come out of them is Windows based. Going against any relative targets, let's say a nation of Mac users, what is the cyber power of this nation? And the fact is that we're starting to discuss this on, not to insult the cyber policy folks, but we're discussing it on as simplistic terms as reporters are talking about this stuff. The great, powerful cyber nation of whatever stan. And the truth is that all of their capabilities have to do with relative targets. They're based for Windows versus Linux. They're based for this type of target versus the other. They can only do ICS damage against Siemens, but not against this other type of target. And at the end of the day, that's just too complex to discuss, but there isn't really an objective measure of power that has nothing, that is measured irrelevant to the target. And I don't know how to put that, but to me, it really relates.
No, I absolutely. Sorry, I absolutely agree, and I think that this is one of the things I tried to mention and did not get it across well. Is the idea that cyber power, in terms of offense, is in a lot of ways actually dependent on the vulnerability. This is like you need a tab A and a slot B, and if they don't fit, then you don't have a cyber. So if I've killed JD. But if your attack just doesn't work against the other side, it's not really an attack. It's not useful. And I think that needs to be recognized in some way.
You can own the whole world, by only being able to do Ruby on Rails exploits. Like literally nothing else. I could own every single company on earth, or only being able to do Linux locals, or only being this.
But what
you can salami
what
slice
can you leverage that to?
everything.
I mean,
You can leverage. I
yeah,
could
but
leverage.
unless you have that integrated into part of your national policy of how you're going to force someone to comply or do something, it's not useful.
I have a Sun Spark.
We're going to drop the sun on us.
Well, but I think that's the point, right? Slot A and slot B and a relative measure in between. And I think if we're going to abstract further than that to something genuinely valuable as a concept, it's not the established offensive capabilities that you're ready to project, but rather the capability generation that you seem to have. Not to take us back to the silly idea that you just measure sort of STEM students, but rather, the US can go to Raytheon and to Tau and to all these other folks and say, look, we've got a hardened target that's using this, that, and the other. How long is it going to take for us to have a capability to go after them? They have that. Whereas, somebody that was relying on Hacking Team and only Hacking Team would have to go to them and say, hey, do you guys think you could come up with that? It's like, if you have 500,000 and you give us 6 months, we might outsource this for you. And there's a greater measure of relative cyber power there than there is in whether you were already sitting on capabilities for a wide swath of targets.
And this is the thing about power being the ability to marshal resources, not necessarily the resources that you have in the field. And that sort of comes back to like, can you bring together something and use that as a projection of power? How rapidly, and is that feasible? And can you do it a second time if it fails? And in a way, that's a useful way of discussing power and something to keep in mind. So we are basically in the last couple of minutes. I'm going to open it up to closing remarks. If anyone has anything else to say, except Dave, because he's wrong about Ruby on Rails. Sorry, no, but
he's got a point.
Yeah, but we will have to pick this up later because I think that you're onto something and it needs to be discussed. And with 1 minute to go, this is the wrong time to discuss it. But closing remarks?
I'll just say it's always fascinating to see the very different ways in which the minds here think about these problems. And I love the commentary track that was running in the background. Particularly thanks to the moderators that were keeping the banhammer running to keep it a nice on-point discussion. And also thanks, it's always fun to see friends drop by, whether it's Katie, whether it's Nick, whether it's some of the other folks there. I really we will just start pulling people randomly into future one of these events if they're willing, because there's some, again, there are moments when I would have loved to have Katie making those points herself, because they were great. And yeah, thank you again. Always a good conversation.
Cool. All right. So that's basically all the time that we have for today. It's been an energetic conversation, as always. We have a lot of individuals with individual strong opinions. We come out in a lot of different places on topics. And as you saw, we could go all day. Like once we get going, we don't need to stop. But unfortunately, we will have to stop. We're out of time. So the nature of power was our starting point. We ended up talking a lot about conflict, competition, is the use of power. What about vulnerability? Is defense a power? And I think it was quite usul where we went. We're going to be prison gangs.
You're really letting our best hits just fall off the table here.
I gotta say, like The Social Underworld of Prison is an excellent book. I highly recommend that you read it. And it is fascinating in its discussion of how power is wielded by people who are placed in a situation where they have nothing and they have to put it together themselves. And the way that happens, I think, is a very, very interesting look at human nature. If you're speaking only about very, very violent men as, the representative of human nature. Anyway, Thank you all for joining us. We're sorry that Nina was not able to make it. We look forward to having her next time. And next time, I don't have a date for that, but it's going to be fairly soon. We'll be talking about another topic. And yeah,
Ruby,
thanks for joining us.
We'll also try and have the times a little more squared away.
Well, thanks everybody. I think since Ciaran had to leave early, maybe he recommended How Spies Think and the latest article in FT, which I should have linked in the chat, about GCHQ's ops against ISIS. Lots of interesting stuff there. I have no idea what our next chat's going to be about, but I'm sure that Silas and the Grub will keep us posted. So thanks everybody. Thanks Katie for showing up in the chat, and Nick and everyone. Bye guys.